In the spring of 1851, a wagon train of some 300 people and hundreds of head of livestock left Mississippi bound for the new Mormon settlements of the Utah Territory, and later California. Among the property listed on that train, not among the people, the property, was a woman in her early 30s named Bridget, Biddy, to the people who knew her. She had 3 daughters with her, Ellen, Anne, and the youngest, Harriet, barely an infant. She did not ride in a wagon. She walked, day after day, mile after mile, through terrain that offered no concession to exhaustion, no allowance for illness, no patience for anyone who slowed the column down. For nearly 6 months, across desert and mountain pass, she walked at the rear of the column, herding cattle, cooking for the party, serving as a midwife whenever a woman in the train went into labor along the trail, which, on a journey of that length, happened more than once. She delivered babies into the world while she herself belonged, by the law of the state she had left, to someone else entirely. This is the paradox the whole story turns on. A woman trusted with the most intimate, dangerous work a human being can do for another, bringing new life safely into the world, while legally classified as chattel. Not a person with skills, property with skills. The law made no distinction between the two, and that is precisely the fiction this story is going to spend the next hour taking apart. Picture the logistics of it, because the logistics are the point. A train of that size did not simply drift westward. It required scouts, water discipline, a schedule for grazing the livestock, someone who understood which of the party's animals were in the poorest condition, and which could bear another day's push before the next spring. Biddy Mason was one of the people who held that knowledge, day after day, mile after mile, while also carrying the domestic weight of the camp, the cooking fires, the washing, the small emergencies of infants, and the elderly on a trail that offered no allowance for either. She was not a passenger being transported to a new life. She was labor that made the transportation of everyone else possible. The wagon train she walked behind was one small piece of a much larger movement. Through the late 1840s and into the 1850s, thousands of converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were relocating from the eastern and southern United States toward new settlements in the West, first to the Salt Lake Valley, and then, in smaller offshoots, further still into Southern California. Most of the people making that journey were not enslavers. Most owned nothing more than what fit in a single wagon. But a minority of the migrating families, particularly those who had converted while still living in the slaveholding South, brought their human property west with them, treating the relocation of an entire religious community as no obstacle at all to the continued ownership of other human beings. Robert Smith's household was one small thread in that larger migration, unremarkable at the time, indistinguishable from dozens of others, making the same crossing with the same assumptions intact. The trail itself did not care about anyone's legal status. Every wagon train of this size and duration faced the same recurring arithmetic of survival. How much water could be carried between reliable sources? How many miles a weakened ox could cover before it needed rest? How a community fed and clothed itself through a 6-month exposure to open country with no fixed shelter. Biddy Mason's work sat inside that arithmetic every single day. When a child sickened, She was among those expected to nurse it back to health with whatever the wagon train carried. When livestock strayed, she was among those sent to retrieve it. The record does not describe her complaining, resisting, or slowing the pace of the column. It describes, instead, a woman making herself so consistently useful that removing her from the operation would have been unthinkable to the very people who considered her removable at law, on paper, at any moment they chose. Consider, too, what it meant to make that walk not alone, but with 3 daughters in tow. The youngest of them, still an infant, carried for a portion of nearly every one of those miles. A journey punishing enough for a grown adult in full health became, for a mother walking it with small children entirely dependent on her, a different order of endurance altogether. There was no assurance, on a trail of that length, that all 4 of them would arrive. Disease, exposure, and simple accident took travelers on wagon trains of this era with some regularity, regardless of age or health. That all 4 of them survived the crossing intact was not a foregone conclusion. It was an outcome Biddy Mason had to work for every single day, on top of everything else already being asked of her. Her enslaver was a man named Robert Marion Smith, a recent convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, relocating his household and his human property westward as part of the broader Mormon migration. He was not a plantation baron. He was not especially wealthy by the standards of the Old South. What he had mostly in the form of the people he claimed to own: Biddy, her 3 daughters, and several others. That is worth sitting with for a moment. His net worth was not in land or in gold. It was recorded, quite literally, in human beings. When we say a man's assets were people, we are not speaking figuratively. We are reading directly from how the ledgers of that era were kept. The same columns used for livestock and household goods, extended without apparent contradiction to include the names of children. The wagon train first stopped in the Utah Territory, where Smith and the other Mormon families spent several years establishing settlements. Then, in 1851, the group moved again, this time into California, to found what would become the town of San Bernardino. It was, on the surface, a modest relocation, a few hundred more miles, a slightly different climate. Nobody in the party framed it at the time as a legal event of any consequence, and that border crossing changed everything, though almost nobody in the wagon train said so out loud at the time. If you are watching this on your phone or your laptop right now, take a moment to notice what time it actually is where you are. Somewhere in the world, as this story plays, someone is watching at sunrise. Someone else is watching well past midnight. Type the hour into the comments, not the place, just the hour on your clock. Because in a story about a woman whose entire fate turned on which side of an invisible line she happened to be standing, it is worth remembering how much of anyone's life depends on nothing more than where the ground beneath them happens to be. California had entered the Union the year before, in 1850, as a free state. Under the terms of the Compromise of 1850, slavery was not permitted within its borders. On paper, the moment Robert Smith's wagons crossed into California territory, Biddy Mason and her daughters were no longer legally enslaved people. They were free. Nobody told them that. And even if someone had, knowing a law exists is not the same as having the power to make anyone honor it. A right unenforced is a rumor with good paperwork behind it. The prize awaiting a free state on paper, a right you cannot exercise is not a right. It is a rumor. California's admission as a free state was, in practice, riddled with exceptions the law books did not advertise. Mormon settlers migrating from slaveholding territories brought enslaved people with them under the fiction of indentured servitude, a contract supposedly voluntary that in practice bound black men and women to the same households, the same labor, the same total lack of freedom they had known before. California's own constitution banned slavery. California's actual enforcement of that ban in the sparsely populated frontier towns of the early 1850s was close to non-existent. There were no factory inspectors for human bondage. There was no agency whose job it was to walk the streets of San Bernardino and ask who among the black residents there was free and who was not. This is a pattern worth naming plainly, because it recurs throughout American history far beyond this one settlement. A law can exist, fully written, fully ratified, entirely binding in theory, and still leave the people it is meant to protect with no functioning mechanism to claim its protection. California's Constitution said slavery could not exist within its borders. That sentence, standing alone, did nothing for Biddy Mason. What eventually did something for her was not the sentence itself, but the accumulated patient work of people willing to notice, to organize, and eventually to petition a court to make the sentence mean what it said. What existed instead was word of mouth. And in the small, tight-knit, free black community of Los Angeles, a community numbering only in the dozens but fiercely networked, word of mouth was its own kind of infrastructure, not a courthouse, not a police force. A living, breathing system of watching and remembering, built because no formal system existed to do the watching for them. The Compromise of 1850 that had made California a free state was itself a study in contradiction. The same legislative package that admitted California free also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, obligating officials in free states to assist in the capture and return of anyone claimed as an escaped slave, regardless of how long that person had lived on free soil. Lawmakers in Washington had built a compromise that pointed in two directions at once: free soil in one clause, enforceable bondage in the next, and left it to sheriffs, judges, and ordinary residents scattered across a half-formed frontier state to sort out which clause actually governed any individual household. Robert Smith was, in his own way, betting on that contradiction. He was betting that a small household quietly living out its days in a minor Southern California settlement would never become the specific test case that forced the contradiction to resolve one way or the other. Among the free black community of Los Angeles, keeping watch over exactly that kind of household was a man named Robert Owens, a formerly enslaved Texan who had built, by the mid-1850s, one of the most successful businesses in the small city, a livery and stable operation supplying horses, mules, and freight service to a town still entirely dependent on animal transport. Owens was not a marginal figure. He was, by several accounts, among the wealthier residents of Los Angeles, regardless of race, and his household anchored much of the free black community's social and financial life. His son, Charles Owens, had formed a relationship with one of Biddy Mason's daughters, and it was through exactly this kind of family connection, courtship, marriage, the ordinary intimacy of two households becoming one, that Biddy Mason's situation became known discussed, and eventually acted upon by people with the standing and the resources to do something about it. Robert Smith and his household, including Biddy Mason and her daughters, eventually relocated from San Bernardino down to the Los Angeles area. There, for the first time, Biddy came into regular contact with a small but established community of free black Angelenos, people who owned homes, ran businesses, and understood exactly what California law said about the people Smith still called his property. Among them was a family named Owens, whose son Charles would, within a few years, marry one of Biddy's own daughters. These were not strangers passing through. These were neighbors who watched, who listened, and who kept a mental ledger of every enslaved person quietly living in the households around them, waiting for the moment that ledger could be turned into action. A community that small could not afford to be careless about who among it was truly free and who was not. Every household status mattered to every other household because the law offered so little protection on its own that the community's own vigilance was, in practice, the only enforcement mechanism that reliably existed. Think of it as two competing ledgers running in parallel, neither one written down anywhere official. Robert Smith kept his in the language of ownership, names, ages, labor performed, value retained. The free black community of Los Angeles kept theirs in the language of watchfulness, who was still being held, by whom, and for how much longer the law might be willing to look away. Only one of those two ledgers would still be standing by January of 1856. Robert Smith, for his part, appears to have understood the danger clearly enough. California was free soil. His household was not. If word reached the wrong ears, a sympathetic judge, an organized community, an ambitious sheriff, his property, as he saw it, could simply walk away, protected by the very state he was living in. So Smith made a decision that would define the rest of this story. He decided to leave. The next stop on his itinerary would not be another California town. It would be Texas, a slave state with slavery's legal protections still fully intact, and not incidentally, a much longer and harder journey, out of reach of anyone in Los Angeles who might otherwise intervene. That decision was the mistake that ended his ownership of Biddy Mason for good. Because word of a departure like that does not stay quiet in a community built on exactly that kind of watching. And by the time Smith's wagons were ready to move, the people who had been counting were already telling the sheriff. The man who owned her understand the arithmetic first, because the arithmetic explains the decision. Robert Smith was not a cruel caricature out of an anti-slavery pamphlet. He does not appear in the record as a man who beat the people he enslaved for sport, or paraded his ownership as some grand statement of status. He appears instead as something more common and in some ways more chilling, a man managing an asset portfolio. Biddy Mason and her daughters were, to him, capital, labor that cost nothing beyond subsistence, assets that, if California's free soil laws were ever actually enforced against him, would simply be written off the books, gone with no compensation, no recourse, nothing but a line item quietly erased. A man does not need to hate the people he owns to fear losing them. He only needs to see them as property, and understand that property, once it crosses into free territory and stays there long enough, does not always remain his. There is a particular kind of quiet cruelty in that arrangement, one this story keeps returning to because it is the actual engine underneath every scene that follows. Not the theatrical cruelty of the whip and the auction block, though that cruelty was real and was the foundation everything else in this story sat on. The quieter cruelty of accounting, of a household run on the assumption that certain people in it were functionally furniture that happened to walk and cook and deliver babies. Furniture does not need to be loved to be kept. It only needs to be useful and unlikely to leave. There is no surviving ledger book in which Robert Smith itemized Biddy Mason's precise dollar value the way a merchant might itemize a wagon or a plow. But the logic of the household he ran did not require a written figure to function. Every enslaver operating in this period carried, whether he wrote it down or not, a working estimate of what the people he claimed to own represented in avoided cost. Wages never paid, labor never compensated, skill extracted for free across years, and, in Biddy Mason's case, across an entire continent's width of trail. That avoided cost was the actual currency of the arrangement, invisible on any single page, but entirely real in its effect on Smith's finances and entirely real in its effect on the life it was extracted from. Households like Smith's operated on a simple, brutal accounting principle repeated across thousands of similar arrangements in this period. Labor extracted without wages is, from the perspective of the person extracting it, indistinguishable from a permanent, interest-free loan that never comes due. Smith did not need to record Biddy Mason's contribution as an expense because he never intended to pay it. He recorded it, if he recorded it at all, only in the sense that her presence and her daughter's presence appeared somewhere on an inventory of what the household possessed, the same inventory that would, within months, be read into a courtroom record and dismissed entirely. There is a version of this story that casts Robert Smith as a singular villain, uniquely calculating in a world of otherwise ordinary people. That version is more comfortable than the truth and less useful. Smith's calculations were not unusual for a man of his position in this period. They were, in fact, entirely ordinary, replicated in household after household, ledger after ledger, across every state and territory where slavery remained legal, and in the informal pockets of unofficial bondage that persisted even where it did not. What makes this particular household story worth telling is not that Smith's reasoning was exceptional. It is that in this one specific case, in this one specific courtroom, the reasoning failed to hold. By late 1855, that fear had become urgent. Los Angeles was small, Los Angeles talked, and the free black families Biddy Mason had spent months quietly building relationships with, through her church contacts, through her work as a midwife, through the ordinary intimacy of neighbors, had made it their business to know exactly which households in the city were still holding people against California law. Smith's solution was simple, and in its way, entirely rational, if you accept the premise that a human being can be rationally managed as an asset. Move before anyone can act. Get the household onto a trail east out of California jurisdiction before a sheriff, a judge, or a mob of outraged free black neighbors could do anything about it. Once in Texas, the whole question would become moot. Texas asked no questions about the free soil status of the state you had just left. He was not being reckless. He was hedging. He was doing, in his own frame of reference, Exactly what any prudent man managing a portfolio under threat of total loss would do: liquidate the position before the market, in this case, the law itself, could catch up with him. But hedges require secrecy, and secrecy requires that no one on the other side is paying attention. Someone was paying attention, and by December of 1855, as Smith quietly made arrangements to move his household east, the free black community of Los Angeles was already doing something Smith had not accounted for at all. They were talking to the sheriff. The night they almost left. Every fortune in this story, on both sides of the ledger, was built or lost on information that traveled faster than the people trying to outrun it. The exact sequence of events in late 1855 and early 1856 is pieced together from court filings, later newspaper retrospectives, and the recollections of Angelenos who lived through it. And the record does not give us a single dramatic night with a single dramatic knock at the door. What it gives us is something almost as cinematic, a slow tightening over weeks of a net that Robert Smith did not see closing until it already had. Los Angeles County Sheriff Frank DeWitt received word, very likely through the free black community and possibly through sympathetic white residents as well, that Smith intended to leave the state with several people he was still holding as enslaved, in direct defiance of California's Constitution. DeWitt, along with a small posse, moved to intercept Smith's party before it could cross out of the state's jurisdiction. Smith and his household were located camped in Santa Monica Canyon, evidently making final preparations for the overland journey east. This is the detail that collapses the entire fiction Smith had built his plan on. He believed geography was on his side, that if he simply moved fast enough, the question of Biddy Mason's legal status would become someone else's problem, in a state where the answer wouldn't matter. He did not account for the fact that, in California, in this specific pocket of Los Angeles, there were people for whom the answer mattered enormously, and who had the standing to make sure it got asked before he ever crossed the border. Consider what it took in 1855 for a small community of free black residents to move a county sheriff to act on their behalf, in a state where their own testimony would not be admissible against a white man in open court. It required trust built over years, trust between Biddy Mason and the Owens family, trust between that family and the wider free black network of Los Angeles, and eventually trust extended by that network to a sheriff willing to intervene on the strength of their word alone, even though the law would not have permitted that same word to be spoken from a witness stand. The system that would later silence Biddy Mason in the courtroom had not yet found a way to silence the community that got her there. Sheriff Frank DeWitt was, by the standards of frontier Los Angeles law enforcement in this period, one man with a small, informally assembled posse, operating in a county that had only recently organized any formal law enforcement apparatus at all. There was no telegraph line summoning him instantly to the scene, no standing procedure for a case of this kind. What there was instead was a direct approach from members of the free black community, almost certainly including figures connected to the Owens household, laying out the facts plainly enough that DeWitt judged the matter worth writing out to investigate in person. It is worth pausing on how much that decision depended on DeWitt's own willingness to act on the word of people the courts of his own state would not have permitted to testify formally against a white household. In this instance, at least, that word was enough to move him. DeWitt's intervention did not immediately free Biddy Mason and her family. What it did was stop the wagons. It kept them inside California's jurisdiction long enough for a legal case to be filed. And a legal case in a free state was the one weapon Smith had no way to outrun. What followed was not a rescue. It was a filing, a writ of habeas corpus submitted on Biddy Mason's behalf, demanding that Robert Smith bring her and 13 others he was holding, by most accounts, before a judge to answer a single question under California law. By what right was he restraining these people's liberty in a state where slavery did not exist? Santa Monica Canyon. A camp is not a courtroom, but for a few tense days in January of 1856, it functioned like one, a place where the outcome of a life was decided by who controlled the ground. With the writ filed, Smith's household was effectively frozen in place. He could no longer simply drive his wagons east and disappear across a state line before anyone noticed. The law had, for the first time, caught up with him in a way that mattered. There are accounts, not fully verifiable in every detail, but consistent across multiple later retellings, suggesting Smith explored efforts to have Biddy and the others removed from the state quickly, or to intimidate them out of pursuing the case at all. What is verifiable is the outcome. The case proceeded. Los Angeles County District Judge Benjamin Hayes agreed to hear it. A canyon is not a neutral setting. It is a place where a party can be found, but not easily escape unnoticed. A natural funnel, hemmed by rising ground on either side, offering cover for a camp, but very little cover for a sudden departure. Whether Robert Smith chose that location deliberately for its proximity to a coastal route east, or simply because it offered water and grazing for his livestock, the effect was the same. It gave Sheriff DeWitt's posse a fixed location to reach, and it gave the writ of habeas corpus time to catch up with a household that had, until that point, been moving. Think for a moment about the physical geography of that standoff. A canyon above the Pacific, wagons loaded and half-loaded, a household suspended between two futures. One in which the law of a free state finally applied to it, and one in which a border crossing into slave territory erased the question entirely. Robert Smith had spent his whole strategy on the assumption that geography moved faster than paperwork. For a few critical days in that canyon, paperwork won. It is worth imagining for a moment what those days actually felt like from inside Biddy Mason's own position. She did not yet know how the case would resolve. She had no guarantee that a Los Angeles County judge would rule against a white man's property claim, in a state where such rulings were rare enough to be newsworthy when they happened at all. What she had was a filed writ, a community that had chosen to act on her behalf, and an uncertain wait while men with more legal standing than she was permitted to have decided her family's fate in rooms she could not fully participate in. Freedom, at this exact moment in the story, was not yet a fact. It was a pending motion. And here the story runs directly into one of the ugliest structural features of California law at the time, the feature that made this case, on paper, look almost impossible to win. California law, like the law of most states in this period, barred black Americans from testifying against white parties in court. Biddy Mason could not simply stand up and tell Judge Hayes, in her own words, that she had lived in a free state for years, that she considered herself entitled to her liberty, that Robert Smith held her against her will. The very testimony that would seem to any modern observer like the single most important evidence in the case was, by the letter of the law, inadmissible. Think about what that means for a moment. The person with the most direct, most complete knowledge of the facts was the one person the court would not permit to speak them. Not because her account was doubted, because the law had decided categorically, before the case was even filed, that an account like hers simply did not count. This was not an isolated quirk of Los Angeles County. Just 2 years earlier, in 1854, the California Supreme Court had issued a ruling in an unrelated case that barred Chinese witnesses from testifying against white defendants, reasoning from the same underlying premise that had long excluded black testimony as well, that certain categories of people were, by the court's own logic, inherently unreliable narrators of their own experience whenever a white party's interests were at stake. Biddy Mason's case did not exist in isolation. It existed inside a legal culture that had, again and again, formalized the exclusion of exactly the voices most qualified to describe what had actually happened to them. So Judge Hayes did something that was not required of him, and that history remembers precisely because it was not required of him. He arranged to meet privately in his chambers with Biddy Mason and several of her family members, off the formal record of open testimony, in a setting where the letter of the evidentiary rule against black testimony in open court did not technically apply to a judge's own private inquiry into the facts before him. The room where color had no voice. A courtroom can bar a voice. It cannot always bar the truth from reaching the person whose job it is to weigh it. What was said in Judge Hayes's chambers during those private conversations is not preserved verbatim. No court reporter sat in that room, and this account will not pretend to invent words that were never recorded. What is documented is the shape of it. Hayes spoke with Biddy Mason and her children directly, heard their account of the years since California's admission to the Union, of Smith's household, of the abrupt decision to move toward Texas, and, according to the historical record, was left in no doubt about the facts of the case, whatever the formal rules of testimony said he was permitted to hear in open court. This is the paradox sitting at the exact center of the story. The system built to protect Robert Smith's ownership claim depended on silencing the very people whose freedom was in question. And that silence held right up until it met a judge willing to listen anyway, in the one venue the rule did not reach. It would be a mistake to romanticize this as some grand act of 19th century moral courage. Judge Hayes was not, by most accounts, a committed abolitionist reformer. He was, by most accounts, a careful jurist operating inside a legal system riddled with contradictions, a system that had abolished slavery on paper, while leaving almost no functional mechanism to enforce that abolition against a determined enslaver. What Hayes did was narrower and, in its way, more interesting than heroism. He found the one procedural gap the law had not closed, and he used it. Hayes was, by the record of his broader career, a meticulous keeper of notes and diaries, a man inclined toward careful documentation of the cases that passed through his court, which is itself part of why this particular case is as well attested today as it is. He was operating in a judicial system still working out its own basic procedures in a state barely 6 years old, where the formal case law on questions like this one was thin and often contradictory. Faced with a gap that thin, a less careful judge might simply have deferred to the more established assumption that a white man's claim of ownership deserved the benefit of the doubt a black petitioner's claim of freedom did not. Hayes, instead, treated the gap as an opportunity to actually find out what had happened, rather than an excuse to avoid finding out at all. It is worth asking what would have happened to this story if Hayes had simply deferred to the letter of the testimony rule and refused the private conversation altogether. Robert Smith's case, absent Biddy Mason's own account of the facts, would have rested almost entirely on his own word as the party with something to lose. The rule that was designed to protect a system of ownership had, if applied without exception, a very good chance of protecting exactly that outcome. It did not in this particular courtroom on this particular day. But the story never lets you forget how easily, in 100 other courtrooms across 100 other counties, it might have. The hearing concluded in January of 1856, and on the 19th of that month, Judge Hayes issued his ruling. January 1856. A single sentence read aloud in a small Los Angeles courtroom undid everything Robert Smith had spent months trying to protect. Judge Hayes ruled that Biddy Mason, her 3 daughters, and the others held by Robert Smith were and had been for some time entitled to their freedom under California law. Smith had no legal claim to hold them. The attempt to remove them to Texas, a slave state where that claim would have gone unquestioned, was exactly the maneuver Hayes's ruling closed off for good. Biddy Mason was 37 or 38 years old. For the first time in her recorded life, no ledger anywhere listed her as anyone's asset. Consider, for one moment, the arithmetic of that ruling against the arithmetic Smith had been running in his head for months. He had treated Biddy Mason and the others as capital, as a portfolio of labor whose value depreciated to zero the instant California's laws were actually enforced. Judge Hayes's ruling was, in the coldest possible accounting sense, a total write-off of that portfolio. Every asset on Smith's ledger walked out of that courtroom that same day, and not $1 of compensation followed them out the door, because there had never been a legal claim to compensate in the first place. The fiction that a human life could be an asset had just been formally, judicially zeroed out. There is no surviving record of what Robert Smith said or did in the moments after the ruling was read. History rarely bothers to record the reaction of the losing side in stories like this one. What it does record, in detail, is what the winning side did next. 14 people, by most accounts, walked free from that ruling. Not just Biddy Mason and her 3 daughters, but the others Robert Smith had also attempted to move east under the same claim of ownership. 14 separate lives, each one previously entered as an asset on a single man's household ledger, each one now legally, permanently, its own. 14 names that, until that morning, existed in official memory only as entries under someone else's column, now standing, for the first time, entirely under their own. It is difficult, from this distance, to reconstruct exactly what that morning felt like for all 14 of them at once. But it is not difficult to understand what it meant in structural terms. An entire household's worth of claimed property had just ceased, in a single judicial sentence, to exist as property at all. Biddy Mason took a new surname the way many freed people did in this period, adopting a name of her own choosing rather than the name of the man who had claimed to own her. She would be Biddy Mason for the rest of her life in Los Angeles, a city she had arrived in as someone else's asset and was now going to make her home as her own. The ruling did not rewrite California law for every household still holding people in the same unofficial bondage. It was not a sweeping precedent broadcast across the state. It was a single county judge's decision in a single case, binding on the parties directly in front of him. Other households elsewhere in California, operating under the same legal fictions Robert Smith had relied on, would not simply dissolve because of what happened in a Los Angeles courtroom in January of 1856. But for the 14 people standing in that room, the ruling was total. It did not need to change the whole state to change everything about their own lives. The question the rest of this story has to answer is a simple one. What does a woman do with a freedom that arrived this late in a city this small, with no capital, no land, and 3 young daughters to feed? She goes back to the one skill nobody could ever legally take away from her: a trade. She already knew freedom does not hand you an income. It only hands you back the right to earn one. Biddy Mason had spent the wagon train journey west, delivering babies at the side of a trail, unpaid, uncredited, still legally somebody's property, while she performed some of the most valuable labor a community can ask of anyone. In freedom, that same skill became the foundation of everything that followed. She trained further as a nurse and midwife and began working across Los Angeles for black families and white families alike, in a frontier town where a competent midwife was, quite simply, indispensable regardless of what any law said about who was permitted to sit at whose table. By some accounts, she assisted in hundreds of births over the following decades, including for some of the city's most prominent families. She nursed the sick. She sat with the dying. She became, in the plainest sense of the word, essential, not as property this time, but as a professional whose services people sought out and paid for, because there was simply no substitute for what she knew how to do. In a city with only a handful of trained physicians and none of the hospital infrastructure that later generations would take for granted, a midwife of Biddy Mason's experience occupied a position of real, practical authority. Families did not summon her out of charity or symbolic gesture. They summoned her because childbirth in this era carried genuine mortal risk for both mother and infant, and because her steady hand and years of accumulated experience, first forced, now freely offered, measurably improved the odds of a difficult birth ending well. Whatever a courtroom in 1856 had been willing to say about the value or reliability of her word, the families who called on her in the years afterward made their own judgment with their actions again and again, at the moment when the stakes could not have been higher. This is worth sitting with, because it is easy to tell this story as a straight line from courtroom victory to real estate fortune. And that line erases the actual years of unglamorous labor in between. Biddy Mason did not walk out of Judge Hayes's courtroom and into wealth. She walked out of that courtroom and into decades of exhausting, skilled, essential work. The same work she had always done, now finally being done for her own benefit rather than someone else's ledger. There is a particular symmetry worth naming here, one the story has been building toward since the very first section. The skill that made her indispensable as property, the midwifery, the nursing, the quiet competence in a crisis, was the exact same skill that made her prosperous as a free woman. Nothing about the labor changed, only the ledger it was recorded in changed. That is the entire moral architecture of this story, compressed into a single trade practiced on both sides of a courtroom door. Nursing work in this period paid modestly and irregularly, dependent on a household's ability to pay at all, and Biddy Mason's income in these years would not have looked on paper like the foundation of any great fortune. What made it the foundation of one anyway was not the size of any single payment. It was the accumulation, year after year, of a woman who had already survived the total loss of everything once and had no intention of treating a second chance carelessly. She was, by multiple accounts, frugal. She saved what she earned rather than spending it. In a city still small enough that everyone in it more or less knew everyone else, she built a reputation not just as a healer, but as a woman who could be trusted with money and who understood, better than almost anyone around her, exactly what it had cost to have none. She was not building this life in isolation. The free black community that had helped secure her freedom in the first place continued in the years afterward to function as something close to a mutual aid network in a city that offered its black residents almost none of the formal institutions. Banks willing to lend to them, schools willing to educate their children, churches willing to seat them, that white Angelenos took for granted. Robert Owens's stable and freight business continued to grow into one of the more substantial black-owned enterprises on the Pacific coast. Biddy Mason's own daughter, married into that family, was raising children inside a household that understood from direct experience exactly what it took to build something lasting in a city that had not been designed with them in mind. Biddy Mason's path toward property ownership did not happen in spite of that community. It happened because of it. By 1866, a full decade after gaining her freedom, she had saved enough to make the purchase that would define the rest of her life and the life of the city growing up around her. $250. Every fortune eventually needs a founding transaction. Hers cost $250, and it was recorded in her own name. In 1866, Biddy Mason purchased a parcel of land on what was then the edge of downtown Los Angeles on Spring Street for $250. To put that figure in context, $250 in 1866 was a substantial sum for anyone of modest means, but nowhere near a fortune, the rough equivalent, adjusted for inflation, of a few $1,000s today. It would not have made her wealthy on its own. What it did was something more important than wealth. It made her one of the first black women in Los Angeles to own land in her own name, on a street that, at the time, was still mostly dirt and scattered wooden buildings on the outskirts of a small Southern California town of perhaps 5,000 people. Los Angeles in 1866 was not yet Los Angeles. It was a dusty cattle town, still years away from the railroad boom that would transform it into a genuine American city. Spring Street was unpaved. Nobody buying land there in 1866 was thinking about skyscrapers, because the very idea of a skyscraper did not yet exist anywhere in the world. But Biddy Mason had spent her entire adult life watching how quickly circumstances could change, how a border crossing could turn a person from property into a free woman inside a single legal ruling, how a small, tightly networked community could outmaneuver a man who believed the law was on his side. She understood, in a way few of her contemporaries in Los Angeles did, that patience and small accumulated advantages could eventually add up to something none of the original numbers suggested. She did not sell the land. She held it. And holding it, in a town whose entire future was still unwritten, was itself a kind of quiet, patient bet, not on any particular scheme or speculation, but on the simple, stubborn premise that a piece of ground owned outright in her own name, answerable to no one, was worth more to her than whatever $250 could otherwise have bought. Consider what Los Angeles looked like in the year of that purchase, and what it would look like within a single generation. In 1866, the town's population numbered only a few thousand people. Its economy still built primarily around cattle ranching and the tail end of the gold rush trade that had once passed through Southern California en route to the northern mines. There was no reliable rail connection to the rest of the country. There was no guarantee from where anyone stood in 1866 that Los Angeles would ever become more than a modest regional trading post. The transcontinental rail connections of the following decades, first indirect links in the 1870s, then a direct Southern Pacific line, then the arrival of the Santa Fe Railroad in 1885, triggered a real estate boom that reshaped the entire basin, sending land values in the growing downtown core climbing at a pace nobody buying dirt-cheap parcels in the 1860s could have precisely predicted. Biddy Mason did not know in 1866 exactly how large that transformation would become. She knew only that the land was hers, that she intended to keep it, and that keeping it cost her nothing beyond the patience to wait. The neighborhood around her new property was, in these early years, a mixed and unglamorous stretch of the growing town. Modest homes, small commercial lots, the kind of unremarkable ground that rarely appears in any city's founding mythology. It would take the arrival of the railroads and the accompanying flood of new residents and capital into Southern California to transform Spring Street from a quiet residential edge into the financial and commercial spine of an entire metropolitan region. By the early 20th century, Spring Street would be known, without much exaggeration, as the Wall Street of the West, home to the region's banks, brokerages, and stock exchange. Biddy Mason bought her parcel there decades before any of that reputation existed, when the street offered no visible hint of what it would eventually become. The ledger and the altar wealth, once it exists, tends to reveal a person's actual priorities. Hers were never a secret. Over the following decades, as Los Angeles began its long transformation from cattle town to metropolis, driven by railroad connections in the 1870s and 1880s, and the first stirrings of the real estate boom that would eventually make Southern California land some of the most valuable in the country. The value of Biddy Mason's Spring Street holdings rose with it. She continued acquiring additional parcels nearby. She leased portions of her land for commercial development. By some accounts, her estate had grown by the time of her death to a value approaching $300,000, a figure that should be treated as approximate, drawn from later retrospective accounts rather than a single verified probate record, but that nonetheless places her among the wealthiest Black Americans on the West Coast in this period, and among a small number of Black women anywhere in the country to have built that kind of fortune from land ownership alone. Run the comparison one more time, because it is the whole point of this section. Robert Smith once valued Biddy Mason as an asset whose entire worth on his own household ledger would have amounted to a fraction of what a single skilled adult laborer might have fetched at auction in the antebellum South, a number that, however it was calculated, was a number applied to her without her consent, for someone else's benefit. 3 decades later, the woman he had tried to value on his own terms had built on her own terms an estate worth many multiples of anything his ledger had ever assigned her. The arithmetic did not simply balance, it inverted completely. There is no clean, satisfying resolution to offer here about what became of Robert Smith himself in the years after the ruling. The record simply does not follow him with the same attention it affords the woman whose freedom he tried and failed to prevent. That asymmetry is its own kind of verdict. History, in this instance, kept careful accounts of the winner's later life, her property acquisitions, her church, her flood relief, her eventual headstone, and let the loser fade into the same anonymous background. So many enslavers of this period eventually receded into, remembered if at all, only as the obstacle a more consequential life had to overcome. What she did with that fortune tells you more about her than the fortune itself. In 1872, Biddy Mason helped found the First African Methodist Episcopal Church of Los Angeles, the city's first Black congregation, and hosted its earliest services inside her own home on Spring Street, before the congregation was able to build a structure of its own. Picture that for a moment. A woman who had once been forbidden even to speak in her own defense in a courtroom, opening the front room of a house she owned outright, so that an entire community denied a pulpit anywhere else in the city could finally have one. She opened her purse, by multiple contemporary accounts, to the poor of Los Angeles regardless of race, feeding and housing flood victims during the severe Los Angeles floods of 1884, when the city's small relief infrastructure buckled under the disaster and people of every background needed somewhere to turn. She visited the imprisoned. She paid grocery bills for families she knew were struggling, often quietly, without any expectation of public credit. The 1884 floods that struck Los Angeles were among the most destructive natural disasters the young city had yet experienced, swelling the Los Angeles River far beyond its banks and destroying homes, bridges, and crops across the basin. The city's capacity to respond was limited, improvised, and stretched thin almost immediately. Into that gap stepped private citizens with the means to help, and Biddy Mason, by multiple accounts, was among the most generous of them, extending food and shelter to displaced families without regard for the color line that structured almost every other institution in the city around her. It is a small irony worth noting plainly. A woman once denied the right to speak in her own defense in a courtroom became, within a single generation, one of the people a disaster-stricken city could actually depend on. The congregation she helped seed in her own front room in 1872 did not stay small. First African Methodist Episcopal Church grew, over the following decades, into one of the central institutions of black religious and civic life in Los Angeles, eventually moving into permanent structures of its own as its membership expanded alongside the city around it. None of that growth was guaranteed at the outset. In 1872, it was a handful of people meeting inside a private home in a city where no other black congregation yet had a building, a pulpit, or a public address of its own. Biddy Mason's front room was, for a period, the entire physical infrastructure of black religious life in Los Angeles. That is not a small thing to have provided. It is very nearly the largest thing a single household can provide, a community that has been given nowhere else to gather. She had once been property with no say in where her own body was taken. She became, within a single lifetime, a landowner whose money decided who ate and who did not during one of the worst disasters in her adopted city's history. That is not an incidental detail. That is the entire thesis of this story, compressed into a single life's arc. What a society values as an asset, and what a person can become once that fiction is finally, legally, permanently broken. The wall on Spring Street. And so we return to where we began, to a stretch of Spring Street in downtown Los Angeles, walked past today by thousands of people who have no idea what stood there or who it belonged to. Biddy Mason died in 1891 in the city she had once entered as another man's asset and left as one of its most substantial landowners. For nearly a century afterward, her grave sat unmarked in Evergreen Cemetery in East Los Angeles. No headstone, no public memory commensurate with what she had built. It was not until 1988 that a formal headstone was finally dedicated at her gravesite, in a ceremony attended by Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley. Nearly 100 years after her death, and more than a century after she had walked those first 2,000 miles as someone else's property. Sit with that gap for a moment. Nearly 100 years between the death of a woman who had once fed an entire city's flood victims, funded its first black church, and owned a piece of its most valuable ground, and the moment anyone thought to mark her grave at all. The land remembered her in its own indirect way long before the city's official memory caught up. It is worth asking why the gap was so wide. Los Angeles, across the decades separating Biddy Mason's death from the dedication of her headstone, transformed itself again and again, from a modest regional city into one of the largest metropolitan areas on Earth. Its downtown rebuilt in wave after wave of new construction, its population multiplying past anything the founders of Spring Street could have imagined. In cities that grow that fast, that completely, the people who built their earliest institutions are easy to lose track of, buried under the sheer volume of everything constructed on top of them. Biddy Mason was not unique in being forgotten for a time. She was, in the end, unusual only in having a record substantial enough. Court filings, property deeds, church founding documents, newspaper retrospectives, for that forgetting to eventually be corrected. The land on Spring Street did not stay hers, of course. Land in the heart of a growing metropolis rarely stays in any one family's hands for long. It gets sold, subdivided, built over, rebuilt again, as the decades and the skyline change around it. Where her homestead once stood and where the earliest services of the church she helped found were once held in her own front room, there now stand the office towers and parking structures of one of the densest commercial districts in the western United States. Nothing about the glass and steel announces what came before it. That is what modern cities do to almost everyone who ever stood on their ground first, except in this one case, not entirely. In the 1990s, the city dedicated a small memorial plaza on Spring Street, Biddy Mason Park, anchored by a 180-foot memorial wall designed by the artist Sheila Levrant de Bretteville, embedded with images and text tracing her life from the wagon train to the courtroom to the deed to that very ground. It is easy to miss. Most people who pass through it every day on their way to work do miss it. But it is there, 180 feet of stone, on the exact parcel a formerly enslaved midwife bought for $250 in 1866, standing as the one piece of downtown Los Angeles that still insists, however quietly, on remembering exactly whose ground this always was. The wall's design deliberately layers image over image, decade over decade. A wagon wheel pressed close to a courthouse record. A handwritten deed set beside a modern photograph of the very towers that eventually replaced her homestead. It is not a monument built for grandeur. It is a monument built for continuity, insisting that the cattle trail, the courtroom, and the office towers are not three separate stories, but one continuous one, and that the woman at the center of it never actually left the ground the city later built on top of. She was not permitted to speak in the courtroom that decided her fate. She was not permitted, for most of her life, to testify to a single fact under her own name. And yet the wall standing on her own land today speaks for her anyway, in the one language that outlasted every court that once tried to silence her. A deed held in her name that nobody ever managed to write off the books. Every skyscraper standing on Spring Street today rests ultimately on ground whose value was first recognized not by a railroad executive or a bank, but by a formerly enslaved midwife with $250 and the patience to wait a generation for the rest of the city to catch up to her judgment. That is not a footnote to the story of downtown Los Angeles. In the strictest, most literal sense of who owned the ground first and who chose to keep it, it is close to the whole story. She walked nearly 2,000 miles with no say in where her feet were taking her. She died having decided by herself precisely where hers would stay.